Hey everybody. Okay, you probably didn't expect this, and I kind of also didn't. This video, the current Monsters of the Week on Cat Lady, is technically finished. I would call it like a gold status, and I want to release it for you guys on Patreon right now. But the reason why I'm giving you this little foreword is just explaining why this video took so long. So there are several reasons for it. The first reason is it is very long. It's one of my longest videos so far. The second reason is that right now I'm in the process of moving to another country. So the last weeks I've been on apartment and house hunt with my partner, and we found something really nice, and this is going really well, but this also hamstrung my ability to properly edit at the moment. So it's also the reason why you see me talk through this laptop camera. Oops. I've been editing the biggest part of the video on this laptop, so I prepared all my assets, but it is kind of weird working not on my typical workstation, especially if it's like a really long video, say, with lots of editing involved. But yeah, this is not an excuse. But also, you know, there's a lot been going on. I've been away, and I've been trying to work as much as I can on it, and I'm at a point where I say, like, this video is ready to be watched. But the third reason, is maybe one of the most important reasons, is that if you played the Cat Lady, you know that the Cat Lady goes into a lot of very sensitive topics. It goes into suicidal depression, it goes into abusive relationships, it goes into anxiety disorder, social isolation, like lots of topics that I personally think need to be treated with a lot of dignity and respect and a lot of thought. So it is way easier to write about Super Mario Level 1-1 and why it teaches the player to play the game while playing the game than talking about issues that might affect a lot of people personally. So that's why I put a lot of thought and effort into writing and rewriting and not accidentally stumbling over things that might be, you know, causing harm to people. And that's also why I'm gonna release this video way earlier than on the public channel here on Patreon. And I'd also like to ask you for honest feedback on it, you know, especially in regards to these topics. And especially, I encourage you to not hold back if any of the things I talk about might come over as offensive in some ways to you personally. Let me know, and I'm still checking it with my co-writer and with other people. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed. Let me know what you think, and thanks for your patience. I'll stop talking now. Ta-da!
When The Cat Lady came out in 2012, it quickly garnered an avid cult following, rendering it one of the most successful indie titles in the following year. It also caught my attention pretty much right away, as many people recommended this grotesque and unconventional psychological horror adventure to me, and it was apparent at first glance that The Cat Lady was a game that was made by a small, passionate team whose work screamed labor of love all over. From the mind of someone who grew up with classic adventure games, Silent Hill, and a love for the gothic subculture came a take on the point-and-click adventure rendered with a strikingly weird and unique art style and an unmistakable underdog charm. For someone like me, what's not to love? Now, I gotta admit that I was initially a bit on the fence about even trying it out, and that has a specific reason. The gaming press, or rather how the game was talked about at the time. The ratings were great, but so many reviews and articles on The Cat Lady at the time seemed to sensationalize the game's more sensible themes, especially the fact that the game starts with the literal suicide of the protagonist, a little too much for me not to be a bit wary. Now, pointing out how the gaming press sensationalizes sensible themes in a video game for exposure is about as groundbreaking as pointing out that the Earth is not flat. But in all honesty, it was what kept me initially from giving The Cat Lady the chance it deserved, as I subconsciously projected expecting the game to approach the topic of suicide and suicidal depression with a similarly problematic and exploitative mindset. But you know, you shouldn't judge a book by its cover, because when I eventually played it, of course I found out that I was wrong about it. Very wrong. The Cat Lady quickly became one of my favorite adventures of all time. And yes, this list includes all the good old LucasArts classics I won't ever stop raving and being nostalgic about. And even though there are many, in my eyes, genuinely admirable aspects about it, ultimately it was exactly the way this game deals with heavy, sensitive, and deeply controversial topics in media that turn it into more than just an ordinarily enjoyable video game story in my eyes, because it started to mean something, to me personally, and I respected it a lot for that. The Cat Lady is written with a genuine understanding of topics that most video games won't even touch with a 10-foot pole, let alone manage to treat with respect and empathy without fucking it up. It's a game about things like suicidal depression, trauma, abuse, social anxiety, and it manages to weave these themes into its narrative with a degree of awareness and respect that can only come from someone who experienced this in their own lives in some way, and with a rare degree of curious attention, while at the same time avoiding to come across as a preachy, condescending lecture on said problems. It achieves it through a genuinely grotesque, creepy, emotional, and kick-ass psychological horror tale. So for those of you who have never seen or heard the game, The Cat Lady is a psychological horror adventure game developed by the London-based indie studio Harvester Games. And when I say adventure game, I mean that in the very traditional point-and-click adventure sense. A game that tells a mostly linear story, progressed through object and sometimes logic puzzles, as well as dialogue. The only exception is that you don't actually point and click with your mouse, but you control the protagonist entirely with the directional keys of your keyboard while interacting with the objects in the environment through pop-up prompts. So it still plays in the spirit of a classic point-and-click, just controlled with the keyboard. The game's creator, Rem Michalski, stated that, after starting with a traditional mouse-controlled adventure interface, he felt that this input method didn't perfectly suit a horror adventure, so he incorporated a control and camera scheme in which the characters take up a major part of the screen and are directly controlled, moving horizontally across the screen. This system, for instance, allowed him to circumvent the age-old problem of pixel hunting in adventure games, and it is, according to Michalski, significantly better suited for playing on a laptop, since mouse-controlled games are just inconvenient to play with a trackpad. But first and foremost, this unusually close perspective this change of interface brought about allowed him to startle and surprise the players way more easily than in traditional adventures. For instance, by having things suddenly appear in front of the protagonist the perspective wouldn't let you see before. This reminds me of how horror games in the PS1 era often had terrible camera angles because of the hardware limitations of the time, and thereby, somewhat accidentally, resulted in being some of the most effectively scary games of all time. In The Cat Lady, the creator consciously chose to restrict the camera angles and controls to technically revert to the efficacy of a more fruitful era of video game horror. It is the many little details like these that make The Cat Lady an exceptional narrative experience, because it not just tells a captivating story weaved into a disturbing horror tale, it also attempts to evolve the age-old adventure game mechanics in a way that supports the game's central themes. It's what good games do, tell stories through mechanics. I'll get to more examples for this a bit later. We take on the role of Susan Ashworth, a solitary mid-30s woman living in an apartment complex in an unspecified British city. To her neighbors, she's mockingly known as the Crazy Cat Lady, since her door is always, and pretty much exclusively, open to the cats of the neighborhood. Susan has been struggling with suicidal depression for a large part of her life, a spiral that, as I mentioned earlier, eventually culminated in a suicide attempt. The game's opening sequence is narrated by Susan reading her suicide note right after having swallowed a large amount of sleeping pills.
Thanks for nothing. Goodbye.
But instead of the sweet release of death she had hoped for, Susan mysteriously finds herself in a surreal fever dream, strolling through windy fields of straw and meandering through colorful autumn thickets until she eventually stumbles upon an old shack in the woods. There she's already being awaited and greeted by an old lady who makes Susan an ironic gift.
Immortality.
What? This is the last thing I wanted.
The old lady, who introduces herself as the Queen of Maggots, sends our protagonist back to the living with a monolithic task: to punish and kill 5 so-called parasites. In her description, evil people who thrive on the suffering of others. The Queen of Maggots, a mixture of an anthropomorphic characterization of Susan's innermost fears and a divine harbinger of death, turns her into something of an involuntary vigilante superheroine.
You will become my hunter, serving punishment for their sins. A tool of destruction. A dark angel walking through the river of blood.
While Susan just wants to be left alone. This is basically the central narrative propellant through which the story unfolds, even though Susan is initially extremely reluctant and rather coincidentally stumbles over her supposed victims, and it takes quite a while until she finally fully accepts her new role as a dark avenger of the tormented and mistreated, or, depending on your choices, ultimately rejects it. I'm going to get into this part of the narrative a bit later, because I believe in order to put this part, the cathartic and violent revenge fantasy, into perspective and what it stands for in Susan's story and life, I'd love to focus on the other side of her quest first. Susan's underlying attempt to build a ladder to try and get better and hopefully permanently improve her well-being. Her attempt to find a way out of the dark and depressive pit that had led her to take her own life in the beginning. Because even though the game is a grotesque roller coaster ride of the dark and surreal in best Silent Hill fashion, with weird and gruesome things happening left and right, disturbing and metaphoric imagery scattered everywhere, and a sometimes excessive amount of violence, at its core, the Cat Lady tells a very down-to-earth tale of a woman struggling to fight the inner demons that keep her down, that sometimes gets scarily real, especially for people who can relate through personal experience. It's in part a story about the many hurdles that society can often put in the way of people who struggle with the hardships of social isolation and clinical depression. In my opinion, that's when the Cat Lady truly shines. Not when it presents itself from its most visceral and gory side, which it does quite frequently, don't get me wrong, but when it subtly and relatably thematizes the perils of depression and mental illness in our society. Let me show you what I mean. When Susan wakes up from her visit to the
Passage between the world of the living and the world of the dead.
She comes to in a hospital, the suicide ward to be precise. Makes sense after a suicide attempt, right? Our healthcare net catching a suicidal patient in a dark place, caring for her physically and mentally, monitoring her in her vulnerable state, making sure she doesn't try it again, and providing stability, cognitive behavioral therapy, medication, and moral support until she gets better and is ready to get back on her feet and re-enter society with a newfound perspective and strength. Almost evokes the impression that our society is well equipped to support those who suffer from mental illnesses, doesn't it? The reality is of course a lot bleaker, and this chapter subjects Susan to a lot of problematic aspects of life under the mercy of mental health professionals. Condescending and patronizing hospital staff, chronically overburdened and incapable of the necessary empathy and patience to care for the individual patient. Everyone in an official capacity treats Susan with little to no respect, belittling her, treating her like a child, like some nut job who doesn't know what's good for her. The psychiatric nurses are rude, ill-informed, and hot-tempered, forcing medications on her without consent, while her psychiatrist, who initially appears to be well-intentioned, ultimately turns out to be only superficially caring while abusing his legal authority over her to hold her against her will. Now, you might argue, but Susan attempted suicide, so she clearly does not know what's good for her. But that's where the whole problem starts. The opening monologue clearly portrays Susan as someone who is fully in charge of her senses and thoughts, and who ended her life as a result of a conscious, informed choice. That's how she should be treated. There is this narrative in our society that people who do or try to end their lives are seen as cowardly for being too weak and choosing quote-unquote the easy way out, which is an infuriating misunderstanding that results from ignorance and a systemic lack of empathy. Survivors of suicide attempts often describe their seminal moment as their final and only option at that point in their lives. A well-known metaphor for this is standing on the windowsill of a tall building on fire. You're still fully aware and mortified of the fall should you decide to jump and all of its brutal consequences, just like anybody else would. It's just that the flames behind you have become the far greater threat. The crucial point here is that the way Susan is treated by the staff in this suicide ward is anything but uncommon. It's much simpler and easier to treat suicide patients as if they're devoid of rational thought and agency over their actions, effectively degrading them to lower-class human beings. Which is the cat biting its own tail in relation to the original problem, isn't it? The systems in place, and society in general, is oftentimes really terrible at making people with mental struggles feel like they belong. This chapter, in my opinion, does a great job of establishing this feeling of being misunderstood, overtalked, trapped, and imprisoned without having committed any crime. It's not just sad, depressing, and infuriating, but I think it's remarkably written in a way that employs these very real, very disheartening struggles people out there are often subjected to on a regular basis. Because the systems that are supposed to help often fundamentally fail to accurately support them. And the cat lady uses these issues as a vessel for horror. I love how some of the puzzles are designed around social interactions and the struggles of mental illnesses and depression. The one person who seems to actually do care about Susan, Liz, the psych ward nurse, engages her in long conversations and shares a big deal about her own personal life. But it's not just empty filler banter. The game eventually turns the tables on us when we later find her on the roof of the hospital, when it's revealed that she's herself been a suicidal patient who had disguised herself as a nurse and now wants to jump from the top of the building to take her own life. In our dialogue with her, when we attempt to talk her out of jumping, she complains about how nobody in her life ever really listens to her. How nobody cares.
I've made up my mind. I need to end this suffering now. Besides, I have no one to live for anyway. No one ever listened to me. No one ever cared.
And the game requires us to show that we actually did pay attention when she told us about herself and her worries in life. Dialogue puzzles in adventure games in and of itself are nothing out of the ordinary, but I really respect how the game attempts to create interpersonal moments of tension that underline the game's themes in a meaningful way through traditional adventure game mechanics with a little twist. Problems that society evokes through failure in empathy and communications are solved with empathy and communication, and not by just combining random objects with each other that contextually have nothing to do with the topic. I mean, you still do solve very adventure-typical inventory item combination puzzles, but this aspect of the cat lady is probably the weaker pillar of the gameplay. And when I say weaker, I think of it as having two pieces of magnificent cake, a sweet and juicy carrot cake and a fresh and creamy key lime pie. If I enjoy the key lime pie a tad more, then the carrot cake is technically the weakest of the two, even though both are extremely satisfying in their own way. So don't think I'm saying that the object puzzles in this game are bad. they're fine. The social interactions and the problems they arise and the way they are woven into the adventure gameplay to create meaningful social puzzles, fittingly for a protagonist whose biggest struggle in life was always dealing with society, socializing. I just think those are significantly stronger and way more unique aspects of the gameplay. As I mentioned before, Susan's psychiatrist, Dr. X, also turns out to be only superficially interested in her personal struggle, brushing over her psych assessment without ever elaborating on personal issues when she chooses to open up and reach out. That all starts to make sense as soon as we find out that Dr. X turns out to be the first of the parasites, and his questions, in retrospect, were obviously primarily meant to probe her life and personal situation for how suitable she would be as his next victim. Because he, all along, was a serial killer who abducts female patients nobody would ever miss to torture and kill them, and then recreate famous paintings with their corpses. Yeah, as I said, the game is not exclusively cerebral in horror. You're gonna get a lot of
ultra-violence.
But even if it might be a bit absurd, grotesque, the case of the serial-killing, woman-abducting doctor is, in my opinion, mostly horrifying, not for the inventive display of brutality and gore, but because his modus operandi is grounded in a frighteningly common abuse pattern in society. Abusive predatory behavior, primarily over women by men in positions of power, is a far more common occurrence than many would like to believe, and it recurringly happens in a wide range of settings. The case of Dr. X is frightening because his premise is relatable. If you can empathize with being at the mercy of someone who methodically exploits his position of power over you. Susan and his other victims are helplessly exposed to his authority over them. He's a respected medical figure and the head of the psychiatric department of this hospital. All the employees follow his orders and respect him as the highest authority, while his victims, the patients of the suicide ward, are deliberately selected by him as outcasts of society, officially declared insane. While his meticulous and methodical approach in abducting his victims already makes it almost hopeless for them to escape, in the hypothetical case they would escape, the system would even support him. Because nobody would believe the victim if they were going to the authorities. It's already a very common fear of rape survivors and women at the receiving end of abusive relationships of all sorts, the fear of going public, of seeking help, because people tend to methodically doubt their word, and the perpetrator, in most cases, has the bigger leverage. In this case, there's the added layer of Dr. X's victims being patients of a psychiatric institution, and their word would be easily discredited as the fabrications of a loony bin nutcase against that of a well-respected, established medical authority figure and publicly respected paragon of psychiatric care. They'd be treated as an escaped convict rather than someone who just survived attempted murder, and the authorities would very likely just bring her back into psychiatric care. They would help him. So yeah, while Dr. X is superficially gruesome and his methods are eccentrically graphic, I always found this aspect about him the most frightening, that it is based on a very real threat and problem, the prevalence of abuse histories in the mental health system. Dr. X is, of course, an extreme example of artistic exaggeration, but it's based on a very real phenomenon. In a way, he's a personification of the absolute worst case, and that makes him a terrifying villain. And that very reason is also what makes Susan's invincibility powers and her God-given ability to perform brutal vengeance against him so incredibly satisfying and cathartic. It always felt to me like the cat lady delivers unfiltered blood justice against abusers, murderers, rapists, misogynists, and the likes, which is ultimately what the parasites are, a personification of the worst in mankind. The way the cat lady makes you exert symbolic revenge for victims of real people that employ similar abuse patterns as Dr. X I always felt that Susan shared a lot of DNA with Lisbeth Salander, Stieg Larsson's queer, autistic, and gratifying revenge fantasy for survivors of violence, abuse, and rape. They're both, in their own way, kick-ass female Avenger characters who put up against terrible odds in a society that systematically rejects them. Anyway, my point is that the Cat Lady is great at creating terrifying situations, not primarily through the use of gore and creepy imagery, but by grounding the horrors Susan gets exposed to in very real fears and problems of our society. The third chapter in the game, in my opinion, brilliantly encapsulates what makes the Cat Lady so powerful in the way it tackles its overall themes. The anxiety puzzle. It's a wonderful microcosm of how this game engages with depression and anxiety as a mental condition through its gameplay, without treating it with kids' gloves, and equally without being preachy and condescending. Now let me be clear, it is not a perfect, flawless representation of experiencing anxiety disorder, but it does a few things that I find pretty genius in its execution and simplicity. So, in this chapter, Susan's goal is to avoid getting a panic attack. That's it. She's at home in her 2-bedroom apartment and has to live. She has to do everyday things that improve her physical and mental well-being. A relaxing bath, a hot meal, a cup of coffee, a cigarette on the balcony, while at the same time avoiding anxiety feeders like the devil. Now, on a side note, you might point out that coffee and cigarettes, for instance, are far less than ideal vices when you're prone to panic attacks, and that's very true. But addictions and bad habits are often a part of the vicious circle in and of itself. While cigarettes, a bad diet, terrible sleeping routine, caffeine, and so on can all increase the likelihood of anxiety attacks, at the same time, attempting to break an addiction is just as likely to drastically decrease the general well-being of the sufferer at the moment, so in many cases it is a daily trade-off. Indulging in a vice will temporarily reduce the stress level, but it has potentially bad long-term effects on dopamine and serotonin productions, for instance. It is a tough fight every day. For a video game task, this situation might sound banal compared to what you're usually used to in your average power fantasy, right? But in execution, it turns out to be a lot trickier than it appears at first glance. In Susan's state of mind, every little thing can become an additional stressor and drastically increase the chance of a nervous breakdown. A sudden power outage, accidentally ruining the coffee with bad milk, or messing up food in the microwave, seeing a pile of unpaid bills, or stumbling upon things that evoke sad memories. I often hear people criticize this chapter for various reasons. Specifically, many of the events that increase Susan's panic level are next to impossible to anticipate, and it takes almost nothing to push her over the edge, resulting in a complete breakdown. So that, in order to finish it flawlessly, which you need to achieve the game's perfect ending, you virtually won't get around replaying it and memorizing the right way to do it. It feels unfair, tedious, and ultimately frustrating when you end up screwing up and Susan ends up losing it, despite you really trying to avoid any anxiety trigger and tiptoeing around to do everything you can to make her feel better. You see what I'm getting at here? Yes, it is very frustrating and unfair, but that's exactly how anxiety disorder can feel like. It's not bad design, it's a game mechanic metaphor to illustrate the ridiculous struggle that can come with clinical depression, anxiety disorder, and other arduous mental conditions that can turn everyday life into an unforgiving gauntlet of mental hazards. Now, personally, as someone who has both experienced anxiety disorder firsthand, as well as lived with close ones severely affected by it, I can say that this chapter reminded me structurally of how incredibly frustrating and unfair it often feels if your or a loved one's well-being is chronically threatened by a clinically irritable state of mind. The anxiety puzzle and how it portrays Susan's struggle with panic attacks, just as the whole game, is nowhere near perfect. but it manages to illustrate some very important aspects of the whole issue that are so rarely even attempted to be tackled in video games. It attempts to illustrate the apparent futility and irrationality your own mind can go through when your mental constitution is so vulnerable that seemingly irrelevant little things can tip the scale out of nothing and turn a great day into a hellish nightmare. For other people, it can be so terribly hard to comprehend without experiences firsthand and/or a great deal of empathy, because the things that can cause a panic attack in a state of heightened anxiety can seem so ridiculously trivial and petty to outside observers, and often even to the sufferer themselves, that this condition can appear completely hopeless and out of one's control. Living with anxiety disorder can feel like walking on a tightrope with a blindfold. Potential stressors, traps, and triggers can literally come up from anywhere, at any time, and completely out of nowhere. This chapter always gave me the feeling that it's been written by someone who understands. It shows a degree of respect for a very uncommon topic in media and the people who have to deal with similar conditions on a daily basis in their lives. When you're in such a dark place, simply functioning without getting struck down by your own mind can appear virtually impossible, excruciatingly difficult, and daunting every day, while nobody ever even sees or acknowledges the hardship you put up with. The bottom line is, the anxiety puzzle in The Cat Lady is one of my favorite parts of this game for this very reason, because it, at least somewhat successfully, attempts to turn this into a video game puzzle with classic adventure mechanics with a little twist. It is not fun. It's designed to make you fail with almost guaranteed certainty, and that is, and ultimately should be, exactly the point. The nature of Susan's psychological torture chamber, meaning the other world, as well as all the surreal and grotesque happenings in and around her life, is never explicitly specified. Is she in hell? In some kind of purgatory? Is all the weird stuff really happening, or is it just part of her psychological gauntlet? There is something about the way Rem Michalski writes his stories that weirdly reminds me of the works of Andrei Tarkovsky, quite comparable to films like Stalker, a story where we never really know what exactly happens, what is real, or if it's just witnessing manifestations of the protagonist's psyche, the projections of an id machine. And while you might think this comparison is far-fetched, it kind of is, there's something about the metaphoric language of The Cat Lady that always strangely reminded me of the way I enjoy Tarkovsky's works, crafted with a deliberate emphasis on the feeling of the moment. Tarkovsky always knowingly chose metaphors over symbolism. A symbol contains within itself a definite meaning, a certain intellectual formula, while a metaphor is an image possessing the same distinguishing features as the world it represents. An image, as opposed to a symbol, is indefinite in meaning. It leaves the interpretation to the viewer, or player in this case. As a matter of fact, Rem Michalski confirmed in several interviews, and also in a private conversation I had with him about the making of The Cat Lady, that he never writes scenes with a fixed interpretation in mind, but that his mode of operation is strongly led by gut instinct. His intention is to let people come up with their own interpretations. It means what it makes you feel. Which is why the approach of basing all the flashy, gory horror on real, relatable themes is so effective. It gives Susan's ordeal meaning. Beneath all of the blood and surreal imagery, The Cat Lady is the story of someone who is fighting against depression and dealing with the stones society puts in her way. As with the examples I showed before, Susan's hell is other people. Much of the game's horror is drawn from bad shit that people do to each other, quite often by the ones who should care the most. Another magnificent example for this is Susan's flashback to the traumatic days of her marriage, in which her husband becomes increasingly self-absorbed and grows ignorant to Susan's situation with their baby at home. The unavoidable conversation she is forced to have on a daily basis with him, an increasingly aggressive and abusive partner, are, in my opinion, far more anxiety-inducing than any of the game's more graphic moments. Any attempt of communicating is futile. If Susan tries to appease him, he accuses her of laziness and weakness. If she confronts him, he reads it as confirmation for his frustration with her. When people end up in situations like these, those on the sideline often comment with remarks like, "Well, why didn't you just leave?" But it's rarely that simple, especially when it comes to abusive relationships. Situations like these don't just emerge overnight, and people who engage in sustained abusive behavior in relationships are often subconsciously very effective at systematically isolating their partner from friends and family over an extended period of time, often in more than one way at the same time. In Susan's case, making her accept and commit to give up her job to become a stay-at-home mom, which not only imbues a massive responsibility on her, but it also makes her and her child financially dependent on the husband. At the same time, he repeatedly devalues her hard work and efforts, methodically degrading her while denying her situation the deserved empathy and respect, pushing her in a position where she's categorically forced to make excuses for his oppressive and destructive behavior because she and the kid have simply no viable way out. I've always found this part extremely uncomfortable to stomach, because the patterns at work here are, as the other examples shown before, based on very real relationship patterns, and I've actually had conversations with, to my taste, far too many friends who, at some point in their lives, found themselves subjected to very similar abuse patterns in their relationships. Some of them who actually played the cat lady even ended up telling me how extremely uneasy this segment of the game had made them, because of how close it hit to home. Now let me say this, if you have an ongoing traumatic relationship with experiences of abuse in your past, and are considering to play the cat lady for the first time, I recommend to consider this before you play it. But in the end, ultimately, this is yet another testament to the author's ability to effectively draw horror from real-world issues most games wouldn't ever dare to tackle. Because why invent monsters when life is already full of it? Now, after all of this, you might get the impression that the cat lady is an endless ordeal of suffering. And it kind of is, if it weren't for Susan's immortality and her Punisher task. This is easily the most polarizing aspect about the cat lady's story, with many people finding it just too much, overdone, and too easily drifting off into splatter and gore. And the other side of the audience specifically enjoying the satisfaction and empowerment this revenge fantasy brings with it. I don't think it really matters which side I'm on here, but if you'd subpoena me, I'd probably say that I'm in the second camp. But the reason it doesn't really matter is because I've never really took this part of the story very literal. As I've said before, it means what you feel it means. And I agree that if you take this revenge spree across a shitload of ridiculously gruesome and sadistic mass murderers that all just so happen to live either near a protagonist's apartment complex or in very close proximity, if you take this literal, you're gonna have a hard time taking the game seriously in any way.
Now that's really stupid.
Fair enough. That didn't really happen.
I've always seen her fight against the parasites. I mean, the name alone suggests that these people represent something that feeds on Susan's force of life. I've always regarded it as a metaphor for the immense hardship that comes with trying to get herself out of the depressive, figurative swamp of her life. Getting one's life back on track from a dark place like Susan is in is an arduous Sisyphus task. It's ugly, it's nasty, and it requires drastic, violent changes in pretty much every aspect of one's life. It's an ordeal that can appear next to impossible when you've been stuck in it for so long. And that is, in most cases, not achievable without external help, without breaking out of the debilitating comfort zone. And this is where Mitzi comes into play. Susan's sidekick character, Mitzi Hunt, always represented this side of the healing process for me. She literally breaks into Susan's comfort zone, and she turns out to be exactly the catalyst Susan so desperately needs to turn her life around. Mitzi's entrance in Chapter 3 in many ways is a significant change of pace, both for the game when she quote-unquote enters the stage, and for Susan's life when she becomes a part of it. The game still deals with a lot of dark shit, but Mitzi's presence is the ultimate embodiment of hope. She has every right to be just as hurt and devastated by other people as Susan is, yet her constantly positive and optimistic demeanor in the face of terminal cancer and the recent loss of her loved one gives Susan the perspective she so desperately needs. The relationship, once Susan overcomes her intuitive social barriers and brings herself to let someone in on her life for the first time in many years, quickly develops into a genuine friendship. Both women find themselves in the darkest place of their lives, but by opening up to someone else, they begin to genuinely care for each other and help each other to achieve something they both could not achieve on their own. Their bond is a symbiosis, each on their own contributing a part of themselves so that their synthesis becomes a stronger unity than the sum of the two lonely individuals. Mitzi Hunt is literally the antithesis of the parasites. And in the same way, Mitzi's role in the game, to me, is both a very enjoyable, literal story of friendship and hope between two people in the darkest spot of their lives, as well as a metaphor for the healing power of community, friendship, and the will to care for someone else that Susan so dearly requires to fight her inner demons, her parasites. That is what Susan both metaphorically and literally does in The Cat Lady. She fights parasites. It's a very empowering metaphor for the fight against the crippling effects of mental illness. And unlike large parts of society, where mental health struggles get regularly misunderstood, mocked, belittled, and scapegoated for every wrong in the world that people are too lazy to critically look into, The Cat Lady does never shy away from at least attempting to portray this very struggle as brutal and violent as it really is. In the end, no matter which of the 4 endings of the game you reach, Susan's inner growth and her attempt to overcome the darkness in her way ultimately comes from her finding the thing in life that she enjoys with a passion. Helping others, as she finds out, is the motivation she needed in life to break out of her isolation chamber, and that gets her to, over time, slowly but actively open up more and more. What might appear to an outside observer like a trivial step, for some people, it marks the end of a long and arduous road of repeated attempts of self-improvement, cold and hard reflection, and the iron will to work towards a more healthy, more happy, more stable and hopeful life. Here's this game that begins with the literal suicide of the protagonist, and that, after an arduous gauntlet of struggle and suffering, ends with a genuinely hopeful and positive message. A game that acknowledges the immense hardships of conditions like clinical depression, anxiety disorder, and social isolation, and that ultimately comes to the conclusion that, despite everything, it's not hopeless, that the fight is not absurd, but worth it. And that's why I respect The Cat Lady so much. Is it a perfect game? A flawless portrayal of mental illness and depression? Of course not. But it is a tale that acknowledges the struggle of the depressed from a point of personal experience, and it attempts to paint the invisible struggle that few people even see in an empowering light. It tells those who silently suffer like Susan not just that attempting to fight your inner demons is worth it, but that you're seriously fucking kick-ass for trying.